NFL Primetime. Many consider it the greatest sports TV show of all time. Debuting all the way back in 1987, NFL Primetime helped expand the game of football across generations, building a legendary reputation in the process. The show was hosted by Chris Berman and Tom Jackson, who enthralled viewers every Sunday night with their remarkable storytelling and undeniable chemistry. The show was a huge success for ESPN, generating massive ratings that were unheard of for a show of its kind. There hasn't been anything like it on TV since, and there probably never will be again. Like everything, NFL Primetime has a story, so for this video we're going to be telling that story, as well as touching on some other things. So sit back and unwind as we pay tribute to the greatest sports TV show of all time, NFL Primetime.
NFL Primetime!
In 1987, ESPN acquired the rights to broadcast 8 NFL games during the regular season. The games would be telecasted on Sunday nights, and this would morph into what we know today as Sunday Night Football. Because they were now broadcasting NFL games, ESPN wanted to maximize their NFL coverage. So starting in 1987, they debuted a groundbreaking highlight show called NFL Primetime. The show would recap the day's action across the NFL, as well as preview the Sunday night game that would follow. It would air every Sunday night leading into Sunday Night Football. What set apart NFL Primetime from every other highlight show was that it would show extended highlights rather than just showing 30 seconds or so. It would be doing a legitimate in-depth recap of every game across the NFL, something that had never been done before. The show would be hosted by Chris Berman and Tom Jackson. Berman, a 1977 Brown University graduate, had been with ESPN since 1979. Jackson, a former NFL linebacker for 14 seasons, had just joined ESPN in '87. Chris Berman's role was to do the highlights from a play-by-play perspective, while Tom Jackson was to give insight from a former player's point of view. No one knew it at the time, but the pairing of Chris Berman and Tom Jackson wound up being one of the greatest decisions ESPN ever made. NFL Primetime debuted on September 13, 1987, and it went on to become a massive hit. Its in-depth analysis of every game provided football junkies with endless entertainment. What immediately stood out about the show was the chemistry between Chris Berman and Tom Jackson. The two went together like peas and carrots. It was their shared passion for the game of football that did it. Despite never playing in the NFL, Chris Berman's passion for the game rivaled that of Tom Jackson, someone who had played the game at a high level for many years. In 2009, Tom Jackson talked about the special connection he and Chris Berman developed.
When I first auditioned for this job, I had another job offer, and I was flown into Connecticut, put in a studio, and Chris Berman walked in. And we sat, and I always tell people that something magical happened for me. I met someone who had equal passion, even though he hadn't played the game, for the game that I loved. And somehow, and I know Chris would have a hard time explaining it as well, but there was something that meshed between us. And that has stayed with us for 23 years.
But it wasn't always just Chris Berman and Tom Jackson on the show. Early in Primetime's existence, several different co-hosts would accompany Berman and Jackson on the air. Among them were familiar names like John Saunders, Robin Roberts, Stuart Scott, and Bill Pito. Sports writer Pete Axthelm was also a frequent guest until his death in 1991. But Chris Berman and Tom Jackson were the mainstays of the show, and by 1998, the other co-hosts would be dropped completely. Berman and Jackson went on to become more than just co-hosts. The two actually became great friends off the air, which only enhanced the on-air chemistry they had developed. In 2019, Chris Berman talked about his friendship with Tom Jackson. He said, quote, "Tommy and I can complete each other's sentences. We're the best of friends, we listen to the same music, we know each other's families. I'm just excited to be working with my best friend. If that doesn't come through the TV, we've done a bad job." Tom Jackson's expertise about the game of football was a salient part of the show. As a former NFL linebacker, he brought fantastic insight about the game and made it easy for fans to understand. Again in 2019, Chris Berman talked about Tom Jackson's key role in the show. He said, quote, "He boils football down. He sees things. Tommy's role is key. He has a way of making it seem so simple. He's great at that." Chris Berman, on the other hand, brought entertainment value to the show. Early in Berman's tenure at ESPN, he was given the nickname Boomer because of how loud he was when he did highlights on SportsCenter. This was no different when he was hosting NFL Primetime. Berman's enthusiasm while doing the highlights was unmatched by anyone else on TV. The excitement he brought sucked you in as a viewer and made even the inconsequential game seem interesting. His enthusiasm often took the form of memorable catchphrases like the following.
He could go all the way. Tick, 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 tick. Rumbling, bumbling, stumbling. Then
On top of the catchphrases, Berman also came up with memorable nicknames for players. If a player's name could be used as a pun or a play on words, Berman would assign said player a clever nickname.
the screen to Curtis, my favorite Martin, famous Amos Zaraway. It's complete to Andre, I see a bad moon rising. To TJ, you say Usmanzada.
I say Usmanzada.
James Hardy, Har Harrison.
The nicknames were always playful in nature, never causing any problems with players around the league. As a result, the names stuck, and they were used on the show with no expiration date. It was contributions like these that really resonated with viewers and made them develop a connection to the show. Fans appreciated many other aspects of the show as well. For example, the music. One could make a case that NFL Primetime would not have been half the show it was without its iconic music. The show used First Com instrumental music pieces during its highlight segments. First Com is a popular music production company that puts together music for film, broadcast, digital media, and corporate productions. To put it in simpler terms, they make music that most people don't think twice about, like background music on a video game or TV show. But the music they produced for NFL Primetime was not taken for granted by anyone. Viewers loved it. In fact, if you go on YouTube today, you'll see the music from the show everywhere, with some songs gaining over 1 million views. The music pieces were epic, perfectly going along with the magnitude of each game. You're probably familiar with some of the songs. But above all, the best aspect of NFL Primetime was the remarkable storytelling. Each highlight segment was almost like a mini movie. For instance, important games would have cinematic music, which would set the tone for an epic showdown between two teams. The highlights would start with footage from pregame and then slowly progress all the way through the game, showing everything from touchdowns to the less important plays like a key first down or even a milestone a player achieved. Chris Berman's philosophy was to not spoil the result of the game until the highlights were finished. This was vital to the cinematic feel the show created. By the end of a segment, especially if it was an important game, you would sometimes feel like you had just watched a documentary. I recommend checking out any AFC or NFC title game that NFL Primetime covered, and you'll see what I mean. I'll link to a Primetime video of my choice and put it in the description of this video. So all of these things clearly played a big role in NFL Primetime's success. But in the interest of full transparency, it wouldn't be fair to not bring up this next point. NFL Primetime debuted in 1987, predating the internet and NFL Sunday Ticket. Because of this, Primetime was must-see TV if you were someone who lived out of market from your favorite team. Sunday Ticket wouldn't be introduced until 1994, and video highlights wouldn't be available on the internet until much later. And even when those things were introduced, they still wouldn't be widely available to the public for some time. For the majority of NFL Primetime's run on TV, it really was the only place where you could keep up with out-of-market games, so there's no denying the mandatory viewing nature of the show played a role in its success. But don't mistake that for the only reason the show was a hit. The other aspects I laid out are what elevated it and made it a masterpiece. If the same show had uninspiring hosts and generic music, I can assure you you would not be watching this video here today. Unsurprisingly, the show dominated in the ratings. In fact, it drew in around 5 million viewers a night in its heyday, a number that was unprecedented for a highlight show. These numbers made it the highest rated studio show in the history of cable TV. Because cable TV ratings are nothing like they used to be, you can take it to the bank that this record will stand forever. The show would develop such a big brand, it would go on to spawn its own video game. In 2001, video game developer Konami released ESPN NFL Primetime 2002. The game featured commentary from Chris Berman and Tom Jackson, and it included ESPN-style presentation. It was released for the PlayStation 2, original Xbox, and Windows. Getting back to the content of the show now, let's focus more on the format. Chris Berman opened every show in a welcoming way, inviting viewers at home to spend the next hour with he and Tom Jackson. Berman also made it a staple to mention any major holiday. For example, if the show was airing a week or so before Thanksgiving, he would always say, quote, "Let us be among the first to wish you a happy Thanksgiving." Then the first show back from Thanksgiving, he would say, quote, "Let us be among the last to wish you a happy Thanksgiving." The neighborly vibe from Berman was always appreciated by fans, and it played a key role in them developing a bond with the show. As the show went along, Berman and Jackson would stop every 3 games or so and take a few minutes to discuss one of the games. This was always Tom Jackson's time to shine, as he was usually given more airtime to break down film from a given game.
I want to show you this football team and what they're willing to do in terms of sacrifice for the next guy. It's the wide receivers all blocking for each other. Here, Roethlisberger is going to go to Ward, but it's Burris and it's Randall L. looking to throw the blocks to get him the extra yards down the football field. And here, watch Burris here he's going to stop, deep the corner, corner's looking right at him, then seal the block, keep pumping downfield. Give your quarterback some yardage, make sure he doesn't get hit.
At the end of the show, Berman and Jackson would do a segment where they figuratively handed out game balls to a player of their choosing. This would usually be awarded to a player who had an outstanding performance that day, or who had broken a record, or reached a milestone. Sometimes coaches would also be given game balls if the situation was right. NFL Primetime did it right, for years. This is why it remained popular and drew such high ratings over a long period of time. It really had the whole package. But as the old saying goes, not everything lasts forever, and NFL Primetime was no exception. After enjoying 19 successful years on the air, the show would come to a screeching halt after the 2005 NFL season. In April of 2005, it was announced that ESPN was acquiring the rights to broadcast Monday Night Football. Through this agreement, they would be dropping Sunday Night Football, a program they had had since 1987. Sunday Night Football would be picked up by NBC, and when NBC picked it up, it wasn't the only thing they acquired. In this process, they also attained the exclusive rights to air extended NFL highlights during the 7 o'clock hour, leading into Sunday Night Football. This meant no other show on television could air extended highlight packages during this time slot. But surely there could be an exception for something like NFL Primetime, right? Sadly, no. NBC was adamant about getting the exclusive rights, and when a lot of money is changing hands, sentimentalism falls by the wayside. It doesn't matter how big of a cult following NFL Primetime developed. If NBC was willing to dish out the money, it meant bye-bye NFL Primetime. Sunday nights without primetime? Say it ain't so. Losing the show almost seemed criminal. How could a show that important, that revered, that successful for all parties involved just simply disappear? Well, luckily, it wouldn't disappear entirely, and we'll get back to that in a second. But first, as you would imagine, Chris Berman wasn't pleased about losing the show. He stated several times over the years that Primetime was the most important thing he's ever done. He's even referred to the show as his baby before. He was later quoted saying that losing Primetime was, quote, an F-up of the 10th magnitude. Safe to say it meant a lot to him. At the time, Berman did everything he could to save the show, including calling then NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. But in the end, nothing could be done, and NFL Primetime as we knew it would be coming to an end. But as I stated, the show wasn't disappearing entirely. In fact, NFL Primetime would actually remain a program on ESPN, but with 2 major caveats. 1, it was no longer in the coveted Sunday night time slot, and 2, it would no longer be hosted by Chris Berman and Tom Jackson. The show would instead become a weekday show, and it would be hosted by Trey Wingo as well as other hosts over the years. It would feature a revolving door of NFL analysts from ESPN. As of 2022, the show still airs on weekdays, but under the new name NFL Rewind. But getting back to 2005. After the classic version of Primetime was removed, Chris Berman and Tom Jackson still did highlights on Sunday nights, but in a very limited capacity. Starting in 2006, ESPN debuted a new thing they would call The Blitz. The Blitz was a series of segments that would air on SportsCenter on Sunday nights. It was hosted by Chris Berman and Tom Jackson, and it used the exact same format as NFL Primetime. The only difference is The Blitz would only cover about 4 games, and it didn't air until late Sunday night, when Sunday Night Football was completed. The Blitz was ESPN's attempt to salvage what was lost with the classic version of Primetime. As an overall production, The Blitz was a fine program. It replicated primetime in every way except the name. Obviously, the major downside was it only covered a few games instead of the whole slate of games from a given Sunday. Luckily, The Blitz wouldn't be the only time we would see Berman and Jackson reprise their roles. On special occasions, NFL Primetime would return in its original form on ESPN. For example, during the playoffs and after the Super Bowl, Primetime would be brought back on Sunday nights to recap the action from the given day. It was the same format as the original Primetime, but it didn't cover nearly as many games for obvious reasons. Because of this, the special edition of Primetime was essentially The Blitz with the Primetime name. However, on rare occasions, fans would be graced with the classic full-length version of NFL Primetime. If the NFL was ever playing games on a Saturday, that meant there would be no Sunday Night Football, so ESPN would be allowed to air primetime during the 7 o'clock hour. For example, this occurred on Week 16 of the 2011 NFL season. These little tastes of Chris Berman and Tom Jackson were bittersweet. Whether it was The Blitz or the special editions of NFL Primetime, it was a joy to see the two reunited and doing what they do best. But at the same time, it left you frustrated as a viewer and wanting more. These little teases simply weren't enough. The two of them together was unlike anything else out there, and anything short of the hour-long version of Primetime was never gonna be enough. The years went by, and it seemed like NFL Primetime in its classic form was dead in the water. It didn't appear that the NFL or NBC had any interest in disposing the exclusive highlights deal, so the situation seemed hopeless. But as the old adage goes, never say never. In 2019, the impossible happened. We finally saw the return of NFL Primetime. Yes, in its classic hour-long form. There were two things that happened that made this possible. First, the launch of ESPN+. In 2018, ESPN launched its own video streaming service called ESPN+. Since it was a separate entity from network and cable TV, ESPN+ would not have to abide by the same rules they did, so NBC's exclusive deal did not apply to ESPN+. At last, a loophole was found. Chris Berman recognized this loophole and pitched the idea of bringing back NFL Primetime to ESPN+. The other thing that helped bring primetime back was the booming business that was nostalgia. In the 2010s, nostalgia became one of the biggest marketing trends in the United States. Everything from movie studios to fast food chains are looking in their past to see ways they can connect with consumers. NFL Primetime certainly checked the box for nostalgia, so the opportunity to bring the show back was a no-brainer for ESPN executives. So after 13 long years, NFL Primetime was back, and it would debut at the start of the 2019 NFL season. Chris Berman and Tom Jackson returned as the hosts, and the two picked up right where they left off. Literally. The new show felt exactly like the original show when we last saw it in 2005. The only difference was the new show didn't have any commercials since it was airing on a streaming service rather than cable TV. Obviously, this was not a problem with fans, as it meant they would now be getting the original show, but with 45 minutes of no interruptions. That was the only difference. The music was the same, the highlights were the same, and the analysis was the same. It was the original package, but set in modern day. Unfortunately, Tom Jackson's time on the revived NFL Primetime was short-lived. 2019 would be the only year he co-hosted the show. In 2020, Jackson opted out of doing the show, citing concerns about the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as of 2022, he has still not returned, and it is unknown whether or not he will ever reprise his role on the program. No statements have been made from ESPN, Chris Berman, or even Tom Jackson. Booger McFarland took his place in 2020 and has remained in his spot ever since. Booger does an adequate job, but there is only one Tom Jackson, and his presence on the show is sorely missed. And that is the history of NFL Primetime. If you've made it this far in the video, you still might wonder how a sports show could merit a video of this length and detail. But I assure you, NFL Primetime is absolutely worth the hype. If you're a younger fan and you've never seen it, I encourage you to go watch some clips on YouTube. You shouldn't be disappointed. Once again, I will link to a video of my choice in the description. The truth is, NFL Primetime surpassed everyone's expectations and became a smash hit for ESPN. A show that was tasked with something so simple wound up going the extra mile and leaving a lasting impact on millions of fans. Primetime transcended the typical sports TV show, and it established a legacy. The show was the perfect storm. Everything came together to create a wonderful program each and every week. It was informative, it was entertaining, and most importantly, it was fun. Chris Berman and Tom Jackson had a blast every Sunday night, and it spilled over to the audience. NFL Primetime has withstood the test of time and still does a service to NFL fans on Sunday nights. I watch it religiously to this day, going as far as to set an alarm every Sunday night so I don't miss the show. In fact, I purposely won't watch highlights during the day so I can see them brand new on Primetime. There's just nothing like it. I've tried other shows like Game Day Final with Chris Rose, but it doesn't even compare. When it comes down to it, the only other sports show that could be mentioned in the same breath as NFL Primetime is Inside the NBA, but that's a story for another time. For now, we'll leave things giving NFL Primetime the nod as the greatest of all time. That's going to do it for the video, everybody. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, please follow me on Twitter, follow me on Twitch, and please consider supporting me on Patreon. All of the links will be in the description. Until next time, I'm Ramen Robbie, and thanks for watching.